Do you remember the terrifying first appearance of Nemesis in Resident Evil 3? I myself remember it vividly, because his introduction and subsequent tentacle murder of poor old Brad Vickers scared the living daylights out of me. The reveal of the titular leather-clad monstrosity, and everything leading up to it, was handled wonderfully, and it remains to this day one of my favourite sections in any Resident Evil title. Fast forward more than 20 years and Resident Evil 3's remake arrived on the scene, presenting an entirely different take on the nightmarish creature's introduction, and if we're being honest, on quite a lot of the rest of the game as well. Its opening and the experience as a whole has had its fair share of detractors, much of their criticism wholly justified, but I must say, when it comes to the start of the game in particular, there's actually rather a lot I like about it. And so I thought it might be fun to take a look at both first encounters with one of gaming's most horrifying enemies. So, what makes the original Resident Evil 3's beginning such a standout affair? Well, it's all about tutorializing and tension building, and this opening cutscene, it's all about that too. I mean, look at it, it's fan-bloody-tastic. What the original Resident Evil 3 does so well is introduce much of what you'll be doing for the rest of its runtime, especially during the more open first half of the game, but in a smaller space than you'll be let loose in not long after, where Resident Evil left you alone in a mansion filled with unspeakable horrors and said, have at it, and Resident Evil 2 threw you in at the deep end straight from the off, with a seemingly endless horde of zombies surrounding you. 3's opening is generally a much more measured experience. After Jill explodes out of her apartment building, alright, I did say generally much more measured, you're faced with the most basic of skill checks, a single zombie, before you're given some breathing room along with the opportunity to explore a warehouse. This smallish area is designed to introduce you to nearly all of the game's basic mechanics and even some new movement options in one space. There are several sets of stairs which no longer require a button press to traverse, there's a typewriter, an item box, you pick up the reloading tool, and will likely also scavenge enough gunpowder to use it too. By the time you leave the warehouse, you've learned more about shooting, saving, movement, item management and crafting, most of what you need to know to survive the undead-infested streets of Raccoon City. And of course, how can I forget about Dario Rosso, the warehouse's only other inhabitant, who's not having the best of days.
What do you think you're talking about? I just lost my daughter out there! How dare you tell me to go back outside?
I'm sorry about your daughter, but there isn't gonna be any rescue. We have to get out of here!
No! I'm not going anywhere! I'd rather starve to death in here than be eaten by one of those undead monsters! Now leave me alone!
Exploring the city streets, Capcom continues to do a stellar job of making the environment feel alive. Depending on what angle you enter this area from, you might run across Brad, and he can again be spotted taking on zombies not too far away, leading you in the direction of the bar you need to visit in order to advance the story. There's even the odd civilian or two who seemingly meets their maker nearby as well. While the first few minutes wandering the streets are tense, it's your visit to Bar Jack and the ensuing conversation with Brad that really serves to ratchet up the tension. You save him from a rogue zombie, and then he says this.
Listen, he's coming for us. We're both gonna die.
What are you saying?
You'll see. He's after STARS members. There's no escape.
Who this mysterious he is isn't at all clear, unless of course you'd looked at the game's front cover prior to playing the game, but who would do that? And I think it's fair to say that the dialogue here isn't particularly realistic. If I was Brad and I was being relentlessly hunted by a terrifyingly massive monster man, I definitely wouldn't be so incredibly cryptic when speaking about him to one of my friends. I would say to Jill, there's a terrifyingly massive monster man hunting down and killing STARS members. If you see anyone or anything who looks even remotely similar, head in the opposite direction as quickly as you can. Maybe I'd even recount my own previous run-ins with the mysterious he, and share any handy tips I'd picked up for escaping terrifyingly massive monster men. Disregarding how realistic the dialogue during this scene is, there can be no denying that it helps create an incredibly tense atmosphere during the next section of the opening. You've not much more of the streets left to explore before you reach the Raccoon City Police Department, but the journey there is excruciating. Brad's words linger in the back of your mind, and the incredibly oppressive track The City of Ruin plays in the background. You know the new foe Brad speak of will appear soon enough, but when exactly, you've no idea. 3 lets you settle into a rhythm, exploring, killing zombies and searching for items needed to progress, before pulling the rug out from under you somewhat. Aside from the music, everything seems quieter. There are no zombies blocking the path to your next destination, and the only enemies that do appear come in the form of this jump scare involving a pair of dogs, no doubt added to take advantage of your newfound sense of extreme unease. It is deliciously unsettling in the best way possible. Fortunately, you don't have to wait too much longer for Nemesis to make his grand entrance, and what an entrance it is. It's the near-petrifying climax to your first 20 minutes with the game, and even though you are handed some agency in the form of the final new mechanic introduced during this section, live selection, it's nonetheless a chilling first encounter with Resident Evil's most famous baddie. The beginning of Resident Evil 3 up to this point essentially acts as a microcosm of the game as a whole. You get to grips with the many mechanics available to you, you explore a small but manageable portion of the city, and you're properly introduced to Nemesis as a concept during its conclusion. It even has its own story arc of sorts. After catching glimpses of Brad in various places, you finally meet him at the bar where he alludes to there being something out there looking for you. Then you come face to face with him one last time before he's dispatched in gruesome fashion, which signals in my mind the start of the game proper, as Nemesis turns his attentions to you. The conclusion of Brad's story wraps everything up in a neat little bow and gives 3's opening this almost self-contained feel. It is an extraordinarily well-designed way to begin the game. By comparison, 3's remake is a much faster paced affair. It again begins with a cutscene depicting havoc on the streets of Raccoon City, this time framed as a news report.
This pandemic has spread faster than any disease in modern history.
And also features clips of the creation of one of the game's 2 antagonists, Nemesis, by the Umbrella Corporation. The original's opening scene is far better, and I would have much preferred to have seen it recreated using modern graphics, but I do also think both work within the context of their respective games. In the original, you see what happened to the UBCS soldiers and the police out on the streets, and then you immediately take control of Jill in those very same streets. It's a logical transition. Similarly, in the remake, you're privy to a news report, and then straight after find yourself in Jill's apartment, where that very same report had likely been playing on TV. As we'll see in just a moment, Jill is struggling psychologically due to the events of the first Resident Evil and what's happened since, and the harrowing scenes being beamed directly into her home will have no doubt exacerbated things. Again, what's depicted in the cutscene preceding gameplay makes sense in the wider context of the opening, and so while I do wish we'd have been given something a touch more exciting than what looks like mostly stock footage spliced together, I don't hate it. Jill's apartment is handled brilliantly. Resident Evil games have never focused too much on characters' lives outside of the events taking place in whichever game they're featured in. Much of our time with them is spent performing acts of heroism in hair-raising circumstances, and that's always worked well considering the early titles especially border on being B-movie schlock. The fact we know little about Leon Kennedy or Claire Redfield's lives prior to the events of Resident Evil 2, for example, is no issue whatsoever. The game's self-contained story works well, and I think there's few who would argue it needed to be anything more. But given the remake's continued focus on Jill, and with storytelling within the medium advancing somewhat since the original's release, exploring her apartment feels like a very natural continuation of her character arc. It really helps put you in Jill's shoes and gives unique insight into her frame of mind before things really get going. What quickly becomes clear is that Jill has been deeply affected by the events of the Spencer Mansion incident 2 months prior. It's taken a great mental toll on her, and that is reflected in her apartment. The lack of attention paid by Jill to much of her living space is juxtaposed against the great deal of attention she's clearly been paying to what Umbrella has been up to. One of the walls of her apartment is dedicated to her investigation. It paints the picture of someone who is having a hard time coping with their situation, while at the same time not being able to tear themselves away from it, an idea further driven home by the various notes which can be found in her apartment. Jill writes in one that she's unsure whether she has the T-virus or not, voicing concerns of an extended incubation, and in another that her anxiety has only been worsened by the presence of men tracking her from across the street, causing her to barely sleep or eat. That time spent barely eating or sleeping has instead been used to investigate Umbrella. It's given her something to focus on, but at the same time, it's without doubt also consuming her. The part of her dream sequence set in the bathroom goes to great lengths to really drive home the severity of Jill's anxiety, and it could be considered mild foreshadowing as well. While Jill doesn't turn into a zombie, she will become infected herself later in the story. In the real world, there's also a note introducing fellow STARS member Brad Vickers on the kitchen table, a sensible choice given he calls just moments later, and Jill once again checks herself in the mirror, which demonstrates that even when not dreaming, her concerns remain practically the same. Shortly after, Jill receives a call from Brad, and Nemesis promptly bursts onto the scene.
Hello?
Jill, are you okay?
Brad, is that you?
Listen, you gotta get out of there.
What are you talking about?
I don't have time to explain. You gotta get out of there right now.
All right, let me grab my...
I've argued previously that this scene isn't necessarily a bad change in and of itself, and I know that's not an opinion everyone will agree with. It certainly lacks the subtlety of the original, which builds tension through a far longer gameplay segment leading into the big reveal, but it definitely works in its own way. Nemesis isn't just an oppressive presence, he is at times also a sudden one, and what I like about this scene is that it really drives that home. Things go from 0 to 60 in a matter of seconds, as they probably would in that situation, and I think for first-time players especially, it gives you a quick and thorough understanding of what a relentless force Nemesis actually is. And of course, it also subverts series veterans' expectations. It's definitely quite the surprise to see him make his entrance so soon. The chase which follows is your classic run through narrow corridors as scripted things happen around you sequence so often utilised in video game openings, and I've mixed feelings. I did enjoy the framing of this shot in particular as Jill climbs out a window, turns to run down a fire escape and is met with complete chaos. The sounds of what's happening out on the streets become louder, and the camera points down the alley to show as much of it as possible. It's quite the sight. Nemesis then appears again, and as the chase continues, this is where I think my biggest problem with the opening becomes most evident. He clearly has opportunities to kill Jill right from when he first appears, and I think it makes him seem less threatening, even if he does still feel relentless. There are multiple occasions where you can stand still while apparently being chased and absolutely nothing will happen, and then towards the end of the sequence, he instead decides to chase you while carrying a piece of building for no real reason. I can't help but feel like Capcom would have been better off giving Jill more agency in her escape, rather than it mostly being down to Nemesis not doing his job very well. Instead of making the monster seem less competent and minimising his threat, it would have made Jill seem far more adept in her own role, which would have worked far better. Let's quickly go back to how he first appeared in 3. There, tension is built over an extended period of time until it's almost unbearable. Nemesis then kills Brad right in front of your eyes outside the police station, and it's like your worst fears have been realised. He demonstrates his immense power, and genuinely seems like an insurmountable force. STARS member or not, Nemesis dispatches Brad with ease, and it sends the message that even if Jill is one of the best equipped to handle such a situation, that in no way guarantees she will escape unscathed. You are also then given a choice on how to react to events, and I think that lack of choice in the remake really hurts its introduction. I also have a closing point that I think may be rather controversial. In the wider context of the original and the remake, I think both introductions work really well in their respective games. As mentioned earlier, I don't really have anything negative to say about the original's opening. It beds you into the game well and acts as a prologue of sorts before the story really gets going. By the time you finish it, you'll know exactly what to expect from the rest of the game. You'll be exploring, you'll be fighting monsters, and you'll be doing your best not to fall foul of Nemesis. The remake's opening without doubt has a lot more problems, mostly around the scripted nature of the Nemesis chase itself, but it again does fit well with the rest of the game. There's no doubt that the remake on the whole is a terrible one. It's much more linear, it's missing huge sections of the original, Nemesis is criminally underused, and there's plenty of other things I could mention besides. On the other hand, I actually do still always have a really good time playing it. It's almost action movie-like in its commitment to keeping its pace consistently high, and it doesn't ever really let up. The original is a much better game, I'd never dream of arguing otherwise, but the modern version's opening feels like the first loop of the extended rollercoaster ride that the remake is, and it's definitely in keeping with the rest of the game. Whether it's in keeping with the rest of the game or not, I think we do ultimately have to consider the remake's opening to be a disappointment compared to the original Resident Evil 3. It does have its moments, interesting additions which only it features, such as an extended look at Jill's apartment and the insights into her mental health, but it falls flat due to the lack of gameplay surrounding those good bits and the scripted nature of Nemesis's first appearance. What the original does so wonderfully is slowly increase the dread from minute 1 right up until Nemesis dispatches Brad. It makes you, the player, an integral part of building tension, and then lets you wallow in it for a good time before anything big happens. That's something sorely lacking in the remake, which really needed more gameplay built into its opening, perhaps within Jill's apartment block, and unfortunately, that's something symptomatic of the game as a whole. I can't deny that it was great to see our mate Nemesis smashing his way through Raccoon City once again, but with all the bells and whistles modern graphics can afford, but at the same time, when he does first appear in the remake, I also can't help but feel a little disappointed as well. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and zombies. If you had a frighteningly good time, do consider liking, subscribing and letting me know your thoughts, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.